This is the famous White Garden at Sissinghurst. It's inspired gardeners for decades. It was Vita Sackville-West's greatest triumph. But just behind me is what you might call her problem child. The garden she never quite got right. After decades of disappointment, this patch of land has gone from a dream that failed to a climate-conscious masterpiece. This is the story of the rebirth of Sissinghurst's Delos.
In 1935, Vita Sackville-West and her husband, Harold Nicholson, who created the garden at Sissinghurst, went to the Mediterranean as part of a tour with the Hellenic Travellers Club, which was a sort of club of elites and aristocrats and politicians who would have lectures on the boats and then land on historic, cultural, ancient sites, one of them being the island of Delos, which is a sort of ruined island. They were so moved by what they saw there, with the step terraces and the fallen columns and temples, and then the carpet of wildflowers, that they wanted to recreate the atmosphere of that island at Sissinghurst when they returned. So in 1936, they took the stonework and bits of old Elizabethan manor that were still littered around the site from when they acquired it, and built, like they saw in Delos, little stone terraces.
They began buying Mediterranean plants, but the scheme just didn't work.
It didn't work out so well for them for a few reasons. They built it on a north-facing slope, so it was shady. There was lots of trees in here as well, so again, shady. And the drainage wasn't there that these plants needed. It was made just before the Second World War, and so a lot of the gardeners had gone for their service and so weren't able to keep the garden up. Vita wrote in the 1950s in a magazine article that, speaking about Delos, this hasn't been a success so far, but perhaps someday it will come right.
So she was planting the dream that it would be,
yeah,
for today's garden in a way.
Even still hopeful. And then after Harold and Vita passed, successive head gardeners and gardeners in here started to remove stonework and plant more of a woodland planting scheme that suited the site. And the idea of Delos really got lost.
In 2018, Sissinghurst's head gardener, Troy Scott-Smith, decided it was time to have another go at making Vita and Harold's Delos romance come true. He brought in one of the country's best garden designers, Dan Pearson, to help tackle the challenge. Coming up with the design, the approvals and the funding may have taken years, but he instantly grasped the problem.
So the site faces north. It's on heavy Wealden clay. Or on the wrong side, north side of the tall wall, which runs between here and the lawns on the other side. So in the winter, this shade from this wall is cast right the way down through the space. Really, it was not the right place for gardening with a Mediterranean palette of plants. So we made a series of terraces that tilted the land back up into the sunshine as if you were sitting on a deck chair facing the sun. And then that allows us to bring the soils up, so they're about 60 centimetres deep, those terraces, which means that we've got 60 centimetres on top of the Wealden clay to play with a much more free draining mix that we made that used about 25% soil and the rest was free draining aggregates. And that has completely changed the conditions of the site because you've got free drainage for the winter. None of this is irrigated, so the plants are we're echoing the habitat that happens in the summer when things dries out, and then we're tilting things back into the sun, of course. And then you've got these big solar gain opportunities with the stones that heat up in the summer. And Richard, the gardener who's looking after this so beautifully, was just pointing out to me where certain things are now beginning to germinate near the hot stones that he thinks is quite a particular thing that's happening now with that heat wave we had last week, for instance. So it's a series of microclimates that we're creating and then gardening here rather than traditional horticulture.
In July 2021, the main Phase 1 was opened, but the final phase, and access to the garden round the back of what's called the Old Priest House, where Vita died in June 1962, was delayed. Permission was needed to remove this modern garage adjacent. Now Delos is complete. It creates a majestic island setting for the old priest house, and Dan has created a dramatic new entrance.
Delos is an enormous flight of fantasy, really. So it's a Greek island in the middle of an English garden. So we wanted to sort of celebrate the theatricality of that, and I wanted it to feel like a little ravine that you were coming through, so you had that compression and release. So if you're rock climbing or going through a mountainside looking at natural vegetation in Greece, or anywhere wild, for instance, you've always got that sense of excitement through that feeling of breaking through and suddenly a landscape being visible in front of you. So you come out through that little ravine we've made, which is tall, so you're moving through tall stones. We've then planted trees on top, so cercis and almonds and some native Greek oaks, which in time will form this little bosque on top. And then you'll punch out into the sunshine and the west-facing light, which then hits the flanks of that new extension. And then you, of course, have come out into that heat and the perfume and aromatic nature of the rest of the site.
So this is planted in April 25. It's much more densely planted than phase 1, which speaks to what the Greeks call fragana. It's this kind of landscape which is usually on limestone, usually shaped by fire and grazing and storms, and it's very low growing. And a lot of these plants are very well adapted to all of those stresses that they come across, including being nibbled, which I'll talk about in a moment, because that's very much part of the gardening, is nibbling this thing. There's about 30 trees in here, which is quite incredible. A lot of them are still very young up on this bank, but someday this will fill in and be a very shady space. I went to the island of Amorgos in the Cyclades a couple of years ago, and what I was particularly moved by with Dan's design for this was how I'd moved through, even in the Cyclades, you move through some of these ravines and you have these trees hanging up over the paths and boulders, and there was the most beautiful Quercus ithiburensis, which is what we've planted into this space, was leaning over a wall, and its old limb had come over and just sat on the other side of the path, and so you had to go under its limb to pass by, and it was completely beautiful. And I really hope that one day we see the trees do just the same thing in here.
Does this remind you now? Does this feel of Greece?
The way in which plants tumble through dry stone walls very much speaks to those islands. It's a very, like I say, a very low-growing scrubland that's kept that way by successive fires and grazing and storms that keep these plants under quite intense pressure. And so we try to evoke that in how we garden it as well.
So you're the goat?
I'm the goat, yeah. But ultimately we are in England and the climate is different here. So some of the challenges that, even though our summers are becoming increasingly hot and dry, our winters are becoming wetter, and so that's not really what these plants want. And so I'm often looking back to Dan's original planting locations to consider perhaps what Dan was hoping to achieve on a horticultural and design level, but then trying to see if I can create a community like that somewhere else. Perhaps like a good example is Salvia interrupta, which when I first came into garden this space had been completely lost in the garden. It's now fine, it just had to be moved into a different space under that Afghan fig, which is above a rock, and it just needed to be tucked slightly and perhaps kept with other plants which may just dry out the soil underneath it. I think is another really interesting thing is an openness to leave the plants to show you how they want to be on their own terms. Because if something sows itself, it's so much more likely to be successful. So it's a patience and it's an observance, like Dan said. Hopefully, if I'm doing my job well, you feel that there's no presence of any gardener in here, but there is a great deal of intervention in making that feel that way.
And the genius is that this is a garden that now seems to thrive not just in a heat wave, but also in heavy rain. I recorded both of these scenes in the space of just 24 hours, from downpour to drought conditions. We're in a period of climate change and it's getting hotter. Do you feel like this garden is going to be an inspiration to more and more visitors?
We hope that this will be a really good educational piece. This garden will not have suffered at all in that last heat wave we had just last week. We're up to 33 degrees. And whereas things, are definitely flagging in the main garden or going over very fast, here these things are just naturally adapting. So they might lose a little bit of foliage. They might drop their flowers quicker, but they're perfectly all right in terms of health. And I think we're going to have to start thinking more about our gardens having a broader palette of plants that start to look to other climates as our climate becomes warmer. And also, of course, wetter. We don't know quite what's going to happen yet. So we're expecting a lot from our gardens, which is why experimenting like this to get the inner knowledge with how we can respond to the change which is upon us is a very useful tool.
Vita would love it, wouldn't she, don't you think?
I think she would. Of course, I never met her. I've read her writings and they were very evocative. They were very much about a sense of place. They're very much about capturing a mood and allowing you to be taken somewhere else and a garden through what you actually do in terms of the art of garden making. And I think she would have approved of the reference we've made back to her and then moving it forward, taking the discussion forward. If she'd lived another lifetime, she may well have got to this point with this place and had another go at it. And that's how we've kind of imagined our tenure here, the permission being given.
And the more time you spend in here, the more odd it seems when suddenly a wood pigeon flies across, because you suddenly think, what's that doing here? I'm in Greece.
Rather than a hoopoo. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
It's strange, isn't it?
It's nice how the illusion works, though, I think, and it is a bit of theatre at the end of the day. But even the old buildings, the priest house, starts to somehow sit very comfortably in this space because the materiality is local. It's local ragstone. So I think that really helps in terms of it feeling like a place that feels right here at Sissinghurst, even though, of course, we're conjuring somewhere completely different.
Not everyone likes this garden. It's in sharp contrast to the soft romanticism of the rest of Sissinghurst, and the genius of the design isn't immediately obvious. But as climate change takes hold and our gardens get warmer and we have to battle with all the droughts and the heat, perhaps one day this garden will become as inspirational as the white garden and the rose garden just on the other side of that big wall. The planting and the design here really is inspirational, and as you soak in it, then you come to appreciate its great qualities.